Hi everyone, welcome to our instructor lecture video for this week's module on human sexuality and gender. In this module, you will read and learn about human sexuality as behaviors. You will also learn about various identities, so kind of central aspects of one's identity of human sexuality, including sexual orientation, gender expression, biological sex, and gender. And so in this video, I'm going to talk specifically about various identities, including gender identity, biological sex or assignment at birth, and then talk around some of those topics. So there will be much in this video that I won't address, so be sure to get that from your reading. I have this image on our introductory slide of oranges or mandarins, because when people talk about gender and gender differences or sex differences, it's often as if they're comparing apples and oranges. But really, we are just looking at different types of oranges, and that an orange can have some differences, right? But there are far more similarities of oranges in this bowl than there are differences. And so that's kind of how I want to approach this module and this discussion in particular. Because really, rather than apples and oranges, what we're looking at in terms of biological sex differences as well as gender differences is a spectrum, that we can organize such things in a spectrum rather than two separate or binary boxes or categories that are independent from one another. My hope for you in this class in general is that you would see much of human behavior in the form of a spectrum rather than in boxes. We will talk about labels in this module. We will talk specifically about labels in our discussion on psychological disorders, where we have created labels and boxes and categories for people based on behaviors, based on psychological characteristics, based on social cultural features or contexts. But really, everything in human behavior and human psychology exists on a spectrum. And so that would be kind of the premise from which I start this class, but certainly this discussion as well. And so I'll talk more about that and provide evidence for this kind of understanding of biological sex characteristics as well as gender. So to give kind of two foundations to this class, let me make myself a little smaller here so you can see. How I want to start is to talk about human sexuality as a topic and human sexuality as a part of one's identity. So I often teach a human sexuality course. In fact, some of you in this class have been in my human sexuality course, and so hopefully this chapter and the premise and foundation of this discussion will be very familiar to you. But I say that I teach this as a class because when I teach this, I consider it one of my most important classes. Now, as I mentioned early on in my instruction or introductional video, I love all my classes for different reasons. I love Psych 300, but I love Psych 356 or Human Sexuality because I feel that it's an incredibly important class, because although we are inundated with sexual information, look at any billboard, look at any magazine ad, look at ads on television, look at commercials for children's programming even, and things are hypersexualized, right? So we see it everywhere around us, and yet we still know very little about it. Often about ourselves as sexual beings, about partners as sexual beings, sexual identities. We often don't have the opportunity to self-reflect. We don't give permission for ourselves and others to be self-aware or reflective because it's so taboo and often associated with deep shame and guilt and trauma. And so it is a very complex, often very traumatic topic to consider, but I think it is incredibly important that we do discuss in a professional and really real way rather than talk about it and how we often do in society, which is in kind of this just, kind of folklore type way, where we're just perpetuating stereotypes or myths or being untruthful in the way in which we approach and navigate and experience human sexuality. So I just want you to know that that's my starting place for this topic, that I think this is incredibly important, and I hope you take this as an opportunity to really consider your own sexual behavior and identity and experiences and hopes and fantasies, and think about what that means, and then be open and mindful of all of the variety of identities and experiences that there are. This class, or this module, the reading, as well as my approach, is one that's based in research, what we know, which I'll tell you just as an aside is not very much. Because this is such a taboo topic, it often doesn't get funding to be researched or researched very well, and we tend to research social problems rather than ways in which there is healthy human sexuality or flourishing. So we know very little, but what we know is going to be communicated in your reading. It is not prescriptive in telling you what to adhere to, either in terms of beliefs, positions, moral positions, political ideologies, or religious theologies. That's up for you to decide, but I encourage you to take the information in this module and incorporate it, critique it, use it as a critique for your own beliefs and stances, so that you can further, believe what you believe, adhere to what you would like, with a firmer grasp, but also a broader understanding. And just to kind of wrap this up in this second point here, because this is very research focused and what we will talk about in this module, it can sometimes feel a little heady, like I'm just learning about concepts. But I want to remind you that you're learning about concepts that are about people. So these aren't just data points, but these are people's lives and people's experiences. And so I hope that you would honor that and think about the people rather than just the concepts, and give value and try to understand and empathize, to humanize these concepts that we will be learning about this week. To start off, I just want to talk about some general kind of categories of human sexuality and identities and expressions, and some language issues. Again, a big part of why human sexuality and our understanding of it can be so challenging is because many don't have an appropriate language. Many may have a language, but it could be offensive. And so we really wrestle with the right language or words to use to describe an understanding. Even for your textbook, I will provide some new ways in which we can talk about some things, kind of a better way in which we can talk about things than what your textbook provides. So there is these kind of a very rapid changing landscape of language and understanding. And so that can be daunting and confusing for many. But I just ask for your patience, and that you should try to learn these things as best you can, hold on to them loosely, and know that they may change, because what it's really about is, again, valuing and honoring the people who have these various identities and being able to refer to them as they choose to be referred by. So when I said at the beginning of this term, I'm Dr. Beck, that's my preferred name. And out of honor and respect, you would call me that, as I would call you how you would prefer. And so we do that through name, but also various kind of positions of identity and expressions. So just going through this very quickly, I hope you would kind of take time to look this over. But gender identity, your text will go into this in greater detail, but this is thought to be based on both biology and psychology and kind of social constructs. This is the gender in which someone would identify. Typically, we think about this as man, woman. There are more gender inclusive ways to talk about this as well for gender expanding people. So gender fluid, gender non-binary, all kinds of words here. Again, we think about it on a spectrum. But this is how one identifies themselves, right? What gender they identify as. Gender expression is how one expresses that gender identity. right? And either feminine or masculine or androgynous or indifferentiated. This can be by dress, this can be by gender roles. For your assignment this week, you will get to dive deeper into gender roles and think more about your own ways of gender role expression. Sex assigned at birth. This is the new kind of language that I encourage us all to use rather than biological sex. And I'll go into that as to why in just a moment. But here, this is what your assigned sex was at birth. Often, what was on your birth certificate. Until just very recently, there were only two options, male or female. But now in many states, there is another option, which is other or intersex. Again, we'll talk more about that in a moment. Typically, this is based on just the anatomy of external sex characteristics, right? But we'll talk about that more. Then there's about sexual orientation, both how you might orient yourself in terms of sexual or physical attraction, as well as romantic or emotional attraction. So whether this be toward the same gender, other gender, well, gender may not matter, so you might get things like pansexual. But then you also might have no orientation. So this would be asexual, right? Or aromantic, where people don't necessarily orient toward any particular person for sexual or physical or emotional romantic attraction. This is a flyby of a lot of what can feel like complicated and new identities. And so if you're interested, let me know. Let's talk during office hours or take a gender studies class. Certainly take human sexuality. You'll learn much more about this. But I just wanted to put this up here as a starting point as we start to dive a little bit more deeply into biological sex. So this would be the question, stereotypically, male or female. Right? And so I want you to just pause for a moment and think, if I were to put a individual in front of you and ask you to determine this person's biological sex, what would you do? What kind of tests would you run? What body parts would you look at? Right? How would you analyze this individual to determine their biological sex? Just think about that for a moment. I'm going to pause. Often people talk about sexual anatomy, external genitalia, internal genitalia, like gonads, ovaries, or external genitalia, penis, labia, vagina. Also, people often mention things like secondary sex characteristics, such as breasts, body hair, the larynx or the Adam's apple, how pronounced that is, tone of voice. Students often even talk about gender expression, so things like length of hair, clothing, walk, talk, right? And certainly many of those things often go together, but many times they don't. So let's unpack the biological part. What would we look at? Well, not too long ago, we discovered the X chromosome and the Y chromosome. Biological males and females have similar chromosomes on 22 pairs, but that 23rd pair is often different. It either is a combination of XX, which would be female, or XY, which would be male. These are called the sex chromosomes. So they're different, and it was believed that these two chromosomes are in control of sexual development and sexual differentiation, so that these two chromosomes control the development of internal sexual organs and external sexual organs over the course of the prenatal period. Very early on during the prenatal period, tissue of the embryo begins to be differentiated by sex. So you see here in this image in the middle, this is kind of internal sexual organs. Very early on, they're undifferentiated. You would be unable to kind of look at a developing embryo and know if this is going to be male or female. But early on in the prenatal period, it begins to differentiate due to the difference of sex chromosomes. So this kind of undifferentiated tissue, the gonads, can turn into either what becomes the ovaries or what later becomes the testes. So that at the time of birth, typically, you get internal genitalia that looks very sexually differentiated. Similarly, the same kind of differentiation is happening to external genitalia. Again, very early on, you see there at the top of the screen, it's undifferentiated. You would be unable to determine if this embryo or fetus was male or female. But this happens later in development than internal genitalia. But the external genitalia begin to differentiate and become either typically male or female. Now, those sex chromosomes are also responsible for the embryo and an adolescent hormonal environment. So those chromosomes start to kick off, if you will, a cascade of hormones that start to differentiate tissue prenatally, and then again later during adolescence or puberty. And so this is when you start to see those secondary sex characteristics begin to differentiate, right? So menstruation occurs, the production of sperm occurs, and then you see continued differentiating of other body parts like hair growth, voice changing, larynx enlargement, and so on and so forth. Now, it's important to know that these hormones happen also during the prenatal period, and so that this developing embryo and fetus are in a hormonal bath, right, for 9 months or shorter, depending on the period of gestation. And so it's also changing not only the sexual development of certain tissue areas, but also the brain. And this is why, if you think back to several weeks ago when we talked about the brain and development, and we did that hand test where you looked at the length of your fingers, and that was related to certain behaviors and traits, we believe that's because of hormones. If you remember, it was testosterone in particular that was shaping not only the length of your fingers, but also areas of the brain and influencing certain behaviors, right? The propensity to engage in certain behaviors. So I want you to keep all of that in mind when we think about biological sex and what, and certain behaviors. But I also want you to keep in mind that it's not that simple. And it's very hard to wrap up into a semi-short or semi-long video here. But it's actually, first of all, even in the way I described it, it's not that simple, but it gets more complicated in that the sex chromosomes most often appear as XX and XY, but there are all kinds of variations in which those sex chromosomes can appear. And I have just a few here listed. These are associated with certain kinds of syndromes. So for instance, one person can have an X chromosome and a missing pair or match. Someone might have an extra chromosome, so an XX and a Y. And so then this would typically be associated with different types of physical development, right, of sexual differentiation of the body and also the mind. Furthermore, we now know that it's not just about the chromosomes, but actually there's a very important gene that is responsible for sexual differentiation. So it's not just the Y chromosome, but it's actually a gene called the SRY gene that's on the Y chromosome that's responsible for kicking off this hormonal cascade that begins to change the body. And this gene is typically here on this Y chromosome, but there's variations of that as well, where sometimes it can be missing. Sometimes it can be in different locations on the Y chromosome. Sometimes it can even be on an X chromosome. So again, all kinds of variations for ways in which biological sex can appear. One other is that the hormones and a body's ability to receive and respond to certain hormones can matter. This is just one example of many cases where an individual may have a typical sex chromosome matching or pairing, might have the SRY, so this individual has an XY sex chromosome. So if you think about chromosomally, this individual is male. The SRY gene is on that Y chromosome, so the gene is present. That gene starts to kick off androgen, testosterone, and this cascade of hormones that should sexually differentiate the body as typical male. However, this this syndrome is one where the individual does not receive or is not responsive to that androgen or testosterone that is produced. And so without it, the body begins to develop, which is kind of the default, as female. So this individual was born and was assigned female at birth because there is female external genitalia. She identifies as a woman, and yet she has internal testes, which would be typically male, and has male sex chromosomes, right? So all of this to say that, one, we should be using the term sex assigned at birth rather than biological sex, because quite frankly, many of us don't know what our sex chromosomes are like, what genes we may have or may not have, what our hormones are like, until we may not develop or not go through puberty. We may be infertile, or we may just actually never really know. So all we really know is what sex we were assigned at birth. And so I think this language is important, and we will begin to see this shift where you will say, I was assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth, right? So that's one thing I want you to know from this discussion. But I also just want you to know that there are all kinds of variations, and why there are variations are for all different kinds of reasons. It's a beautiful kind of complication. So what I've been talking about with, for instance, this woman, I believe her name is Emily Quinn, I hope that's right. She is what we would consider intersex, meaning has both male, kind of traditional and stereotypical biological male and female components. Now, some transgender individuals may be intersex, but most are not. There, it's about gender identity, right? Where the identity is different than what they were assigned at birth. And why that is probably for just as many reasons as why and how people can be intersex. And why people may express their gender in a unique way, and why people may orient their physical attraction or remote romantic attraction to others, same sex or different sex, or it doesn't matter. It's complicated, right? There's all kinds of reasons why that might be. Now, I'll tell you, as a psychologist and research scientist, I think it's really important that we continue to investigate these individual or these interesting variations and ask why, right? As psychologists, we're curious about human similarities and human differences and what the causes may be and what the consequences may be. But I do want to say that what often happens is that the curiosity comes at an expense, where until we find an answer, and often a very specific biological answer, we don't believe, we don't value, right? And there's often discrimination that's associated with. So I would encourage you to think much more broadly about human diversity and variation and the complications and the varieties of why we are the way we are, and to value that as something that can be beautiful. We value diversity in all kinds of ways, in our food and our plant life and our ecosystem, right? And so we too should value it in humanity. It's what makes us human, it's what makes us interesting, and it's certainly what makes us beautiful. Because it's a complicated thing how we become the way we become, right? So we talked about nature and nurture last week in development, right? And that we know that each influences itself. Whether the nurture be the prenatal environment, whether it be the environment during childhood or even later, we are constantly influencing the brain. We are constantly influencing even our DNA, our genes turning on or off through something we now study called epigenetics, and vice versa. So again, to bring us back to psychology and a perspective that we now have, this kind of modern perspective, is this biopsychosocial approach, that if we're going to describe any human behavior, we think about it in both as a biological way, a psychological, and a social component, that all these things come together to influence why we are the way we are, right, and who we are. So to end, just to again remind us that because we have this very complicated puzzle that comes together to form who we are, we cannot be described in tidy boxes, right? But rather as points on a spectrum. So I have just another image here for you to look at, take some time with, that all parts of our sexual identities, in terms of gender, biological aspects of sex, expression of self through, clothing, dress, career, talk, as well as physical orientation, romantic orientation, and so on. It can be thought of as a spectrum, and that most of us are not actually on the ends, but fall somewhere often kind of close to the end of the spectrum, but that there's a beautiful mix of people all within. So this is an important foundation that I hope gives you some understanding as you pursue some topics in greater depth within the reading this week. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns. You're welcome to comment below. I encourage you to use the Ask Dr. Beck post on our module. Please ask me questions. I would love to engage with you there. I also would love to see you during live office hours or one-on-one office hours. I look forward to that time together. Take care, everyone, this week. And as always, happy learning.